Has humanity confused the idea of God with memories of ET contact? That's the byline for the new book, The Scars of Eden, from Paul Wallis, and the sequel to Escaping from Eden. And Paul joins us now to discuss it. Hi, Paul.
G'day, Dean. Thanks so much for having me on the show again.
Great to have you back with us. So let's start firstly. Escaping from Eden was a roaring success, a New York Times bestseller. What's the difference between Escaping from Eden and The Scars of Eden?
Well, Escaping from Eden was really my gateway into this whole topic, the whole topic of paleo contact. And it opened up for me because of studies I've been making in the book of Genesis, drilling down into some odd moments in the story that had never quite made sense to me and into some translation issues. And as I went down that rabbit hole, I realized that if you revisit the translation questions, go at the etymology of the words in the text, it turns out that many of the stories that we've understood as God stories turn out to be summaries of ancient Sumerian stories, which are not about God, but about sky people, people from other planets who came and colonized the Earth in the distant past and had a hands-on involvement in our development as a species. And that's just the beginning of the story. So
Okay.
that took me to writing Escaping from Eden. It was essentially me sharing that journey from a world of 33 years in ministry and then into this field of study and then opening up the whole question of a populated universe. And yes, it's been an international bestseller. I don't think it made the New York Times list. Maybe The Scars of Eden will, but it's certainly sold huge all around the world. And as I was preparing for Escaping from Eden to come out, I thought maybe I should prepare my parents-in-law for this new book that's coming, because they're devout Christians.
Mm-hmm.
They're from Ghana. They are Baptist, Pentecostal. Those are their roots. And a book with the title, Does Genesis Teach That Humanity Was Created by God or Engineered by ETs, might be a little bit confronting. So I better prepare them. So they came around for the weekend and we had some nice food and some nice wine. And when everyone was happy and relaxed, I thought, okay, I'll bring the subject up now. And so I said, Patience Coffee, let me just tell you about this new book I've got coming out. And I walked them through what I just told you, Dean, about what I think the Bible's really about in some of those ancient texts. And I had no idea how they were taking this. They were, poker faces on as they were listening. And then when I finished explaining, my father-in-law leant back in his chair and he said, Paul, a penny has dropped. And clearly he had had all kinds of wonderings and questions about things he had seen in the Bible as well. And then my mother-in-law leant forward and said, Paul, we already know this story. And she began telling me that in Ghana, yes, through school, you will be taught the Christian answers to things and the scientific answers to things, just as we do generally going through school, the mainstream views. But the folklore carries other stories.
Right.
And that Ghanaians know through their ancestral storytelling that there is another presence on planet Earth that is similar to human, but not human, that has a hands-on involvement in our affairs as a species, and that from time to time takes individuals, uses them for some kind of hybridization program, and then returns them a few years later. This is the story of Mami Wata in Ghana. And my mother-in-law said, actually, our family is very, very close to another family where this happened. And she told me about this girl who disappeared for 3 years. I say girl, she was an adult, young adult, disappeared for 3 years.
Wow.
And then reappeared on the beach of Anloga in Ghana. And when she found her way home, she looked like she'd been through some kind of trauma, and her parents expected her to talk about a failed elopement or a kidnapping or slave trafficking or sex trafficking or something like that. And it took her a while to tell them, but the story that emerged was that the reason she hadn't been able to contact them for 3 years was that she'd been held in an underwater base. She had been used to produce children, and the people who had held her were not human. Well, her parents didn't expect to hear a story like that from their own daughter, but they knew the notes of that story because
Hmm.
Ghanaians have reported experiences like that for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. And when I heard that from so close to my own family, it sent me on a new journey all around the world. And I realized that these experiences are reported all around the coastal regions of Africa,
Yep.
Caribbean, Brazil, Cuba, Haiti, as far east as the Philippines. In the Philippines, they have vocabulary that exists only to tell this story. Those words have roots in India. You can then go into Europe. I mean, in Europe, the whole of Europe is named after an ET abductee. Europa
Right.
was the daughter of a king of Phoenicia, and she was abducted by a non-human being and produced three hybrid children, one of them being Minos, the progenitor of the Minoan culture. And what I've just told you is taught as history in
Yep.
Greece,
Yep.
not fable and fiction. This is the beginning of Europe and Europa. So my eyebrows were off the top of my head by the time I'd reached that part of the world. And then you can go into the Nordic countries, the same stories repeat. Into India, you've got the stories of the kings, very similar stories. The Celtic peoples have exactly the same stories with all these same bizarre notes.
Right.
Abduction, hybridization, underwater bases, look human but not human. And again, that was just the beginning of the story. When I set out to write The Scars of Eden, I didn't think the abduction phenomenon would figure that much in the book. I didn't want to go that much into it because I know people really struggle with it. You're really in at the deep end. It's hard enough for people to do business with the idea of a populated universe, let alone being in contact, let alone being abducted, let alone hybridization. But I found that the moment you start listening to world mythology, to folklore, to our ancestral memory, you can't avoid this question of another presence and the abduction phenomenon.
No.
And as I
No.
drilled down into that and pursued that, I realized that the reason I've called it the Scars of Eden is that not only are there evidences in our ancient texts, but there are things about our geopolitics and our psychology as a species that I now believe are the vestiges of a time when humanity was governed by non-human leaders. And we see the after effects of it in all the wars that are being fought today, farming wars, health wars, education wars, literal wars, all have their roots in a conflict that was framed thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of years ago. And the Scars of Eden explores all that.
That's fantastic. I mean, when I started following this and reporting on this a couple of years ago, as you mentioned, abductions didn't really figure into my way of thinking at the time. And I thought, it's just a handful of people that have been abducted. And then, can we believe what they're really telling us? But it, 3 or 4 months into my journey into this and speaking with people that keep stats and then them telling me, well, the abduction in the US alone, I mean, we're talking millions upon millions upon millions of people that have had some sort of an experience related to an alien abduction. And I
That's
just
exactly right.
couldn't get my head around that.
Well, Dean, your experience is the same as mine. As soon as I came out with Escaping from Eden, people began contacting me to tell me of their experiences. And it was very interesting because when people contact me, they're often very hesitant to share what they're going to share. They do a lot of sounding me out to see if I'm really trustworthy with their story. They don't want me to promote their story. They don't want anything for it. They're just looking, is this someone who will listen to the experience I've had? And I've had quite a few people, men in their 60s, who have, it's interesting, they've just retired, maybe from a very responsible kind of job and career.
Hmm.
Now they're in a moment where they can just have a breathe and reflect on their lives. And they'll come to me, and I've had a number say, what I'm telling you, I've told my wife, I've talked with the person who was with me at the time that this happened, and I haven't told another living, breathing soul in the 50 years since it happened. And the it will be a close encounter. And unfortunately, the power of ridicule and the fear of
Yeah.
ridicule is still so great in our culture that people can have powerful, life-changing experiences and then find they have no one to talk to about it because it will be treated as a joke. And that makes the whole experience incredibly isolating. But among those experiences that got reported to me, I have been overwhelmed by the number who've had experiences that point to their being involved in some kind of a hybridization program, who have had abduction experiences. And in Escaping from Eden, I talk about the work of Professor John Mack, who was the head of clinical psychology at Harvard. And he was invited by US Defense to psychoanalyze defense personnel who were reporting abduction and hybridization experiences. Essentially, they wanted to know, is there any pathology here? Are they sane? Are they safe to fly? That was their interest in it. So John Mack developed protocols for interviewing, assessing, analyzing about 50 personnel he went through in his research. And he came away saying that his approach and his method had demonstrated not only no pathology in those people, but that they had experienced something objectively real. And as I've spoken with people, I have found, just as Professor Mack did, that it's very often in the incidental details that people report that you begin realizing they're describing the same thing. Professor Mack had a really interesting method where he would get people into a state of deep relaxation and then get them to bring the report that they'd logged with US Defense, ask them about that day, what happened, and then he would sort of interrupt them with secondary questions. They'd be talking and he'd say, let me pause you there, just move your head to the left, tell me what you can see. Let me pause you there, just look up, tell me what you can see. And it was their answers to these what would seem to them random secondary questions that he began to realize they're describing the same place.
Yep.
They're describing the same entities. They're describing the same processes. And it was that drew him to the conclusion that they had all experienced the same objective thing and that it needed investigating. And as I've listened to people over the months and weeks, I mean, some weeks it's every day I'm hearing from people with experiences like this, I've come to that same conclusion. Something real is happening that we need to be talking about, and in such numbers that I believe you couldn't sit a friendship group down anywhere or a family group anywhere, and if you ask the question, have you experienced anything strange you can't experience that hints at the possibility there's another presence on planet Earth? I don't think there would be a family or a friendship circle anywhere that wouldn't have a story.
Yep.
And I share a bit of my own experience in the book because I really want to coax that out of people. Do you have an experience that you can half remember? You remember the beginning of something, you're not sure what happened next. If we pull all those kinds of stories, I think we'll be amazed at what bigger picture emerges.
And I mean, I've interviewed dozens and dozens and dozens of experiences now, and there's always a common theme. And so it got me thinking about my school days and back in those days when there were kids in school that you knew just didn't fit in, would always keep their distance, would always have something on their mind. And I always used to think maybe it's something going on with them in their home life. But gosh, I mean, you think about it now, were those kids going through some sort of experiences back then?
Oh, that is a very insightful question indeed. I mean, I am sure that a proportion of those that you're remembering were going through stuff at home. I think in this generation, we're discovering just how rife and how prevalent that kind of abuse is in families, in institutions. But my research for the Scars of Eden suggests that that is actually only one aspect of abusive behaviors that human beings are experiencing, not just at each other's hands, but at the hands of other visitors to our planet. And if you have an experience where you have been taken or abused, and not only are you scared to talk about it because of who was involved, but you're scared to talk about it because it's just blown your whole worldview open. Now you live in a universe that has other kind of beings in it that no one else can see and no one else believes in.
Yep.
How profoundly isolating is that? And so with the Scars of Eden, my hope is that we can get far more conversation going in the mainstream about the question of populated universe, about the question of contact, to try and remove a degree more of the ridicule and the mockery that is often brought to the topic. If we can do that, then people can talk about experiences that have changed their lives and often traumatized them. And I just think we owe it to each other to listen with respect to one another. When somebody comes forward with a story of contact, they know that's not going to get them any kudos. It's not going to make them money. It's not going to gain them respect. It's not going to help them get a better job. They know what the cost will be. And so when you hear someone coming forward, you have to give them a respectful hearing, understanding they know they're taking their life in their hands by bringing the report. And I would love to see our culture shift to the point where we can listen to one another more openly and let some other unfamiliar stories emerge.
The beginning of the book, classic scene of Paul laying back in bed and looking towards the end of the bed with several small creatures standing at the end of his bed. Now, was that you?
Yes, yes, that is the author in the book. And in The Scars of Eden, I share 2 or 3 of my own personal experiences. And the reason I do that is not to prove anything at all. And my experiences are so undramatic compared with testimony you can find. If you just go to YouTube and Google alien abduction, you'll find some dramatic stories. I was blown away just recently. A lady called Jane Pooley in Australia.
Yep.
She's
Yep.
very down-to-earth person, a registered nurse. She's had a very respectable career. She's got 3 healthy, normal children. But she went on TV. It was Channel 9, Studio 10, was interviewed by the chair of Australian ABC, Ita Buttrose, and given a very respectful hearing, as she said that she had been abducted several times since childhood and had been used to produce 2 hybrid children. Well, that's a very dramatic experience, and I applaud Jane Pooley for going on television with a story that she knows will lay her open to ridicule. My story is not like that. It's not like a Whitley Strieber story. My stories are something happened, and I'm not quite sure what it was. At the time, I thought it was this. Now I'm thinking it might have been an extraterrestrial encounter. But they're the kinds of stories you hesitate to tell because they sound like nothing, because I've got nothing to support it, because not much happened. But the reason I tell my stories is I think that thousands, maybe millions of us are in exactly the same boat, where we have a half memory, where something odd happened that doesn't quite add up. And those are the stories I would love for people to begin sharing, because as we listen to each other, I think we will fill each other's picture out, and they relate to the whole question of ET contact.
And for our audience outside Australia, Ita Buttrose is like Down Under's answer to Oprah Winfrey, I guess, in some respects.
Well, she has enormous credibility, as you can imagine, being the chair of Australian ABC. She's an absolute household name. People love her. She's very grounded, sensible lady. I mean, in terms of the respect she gets, I would say think of David Attenborough.
Right.
It's that kind of credibility that she carries.
And so big. I mean, we're talking, I think, all the way back to the 60s, 70s and 80s. In fact, so big that Australia's greatest ever rock band, Cold Chisel, actually did a song about her.
Indeed. Yep. And I should say, I mean, Ita Buttrose, when she did that interview, she is the interviewer. So she's not endorsing the story. She's not saying what she believes, but what she did do was give a respectful hearing. Whereas a generation ago, someone with the credentials of John Mack was treated like an absolute idiot by Richard Carlton on 60 Minutes, who believed he knew more about human psychology than John Mack, purely because John Mack was saying there's something real we need to study. And so I note that in The Scars of Eden, there has been a culture shift in that regard. And then, of course, a massive shift in policy just in the last 3 years in terms of the official position in relation to disclosure, with everything that we've heard from Haim Shed in Israel, Alain Juillet in France, Chris Mellon in the States, the Pentagon, the Senate intelligence briefings. Now, all of a sudden, the question of populated universe is back on the table because of what's coming from official channels. And I hope that makes this a topic that more and more people feel they can discuss openly.
Yeah, I love the way you explain God at the beginning of the book. I'll just read a little section here. It went, quote, "Next, I walked Tim and Jay through the translation issues around various key words and show that the word the Bible often translates as God is really much better translated as the powerful ones." And that sheds a really interesting light on it. And it does really open up the book of Genesis when you think of the powerful ones.
It totally opens it up. That's quite right. It changes the stories, obviously. The moment you read those old God stories in Genesis and replace the word God or Elohim with powerful ones, the stories change, but they don't change in a random way. When you make that translation switch, the biblical stories suddenly line up with the Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian, and Assyrian stories of beginnings. And you realize that the biblical stories are a summary version of those Mesopotamian stories. And the Mesopotamian stories are stories of extraterrestrials colonizing planet Earth in the distant past. When you read the Bible in that light, you realize that we've been allowed a window onto a time in antiquity when human colonies were governed over by non-human leadership. And some of the questions that people will have about Old Testament stories of God, and they're the kinds of questions any child will ask. A child will ask a question whenever they see God genocide people, or acting vindictively, or unforgivingly, or brutally, or unpredictably, or making mistakes, or being jealous, or getting into a spat of jealousy with another leader. None of that makes sense if you translate those words Elohim as God. The moment you translate it as the powerful ones, you realize the human race was caught in the crossfire of powers that were competing with one another for hegemony over the planet and conflicting with one another over agendas for Project Humanity. And in the Scars of Eden, I go back and ask, what were they conflicting about? What were those ET culture wars about among those who were colonizing planet Earth? And a whole number of pennies will drop as you follow that logic through the Scars of Eden. And you realize that many of these ancient stories, properly translated, are told not just to explain how things were in the beginning, but to explain why things are the way they are today.
Right. Is it more a case of what we've forgotten over time than just being completely ignorant?
Well, we have forgotten some stuff, to be sure, but in the Scars of Eden, I reveal that there has been a very deliberate and active suppression of the ancient stories of ET contact that were known to our ancestors. And in fact, the Bible traces one of those processes of suppression, because you get to the Ten Commandments, reading it with Elohim meaning the powerful ones, and the Ten Commandments begins, "You will have no other powerful ones before me. Do not work for them. Do not bow down to them. Do not even depict them. Certainly don't serve them. Serve only Yahweh." So in that moment, you've got an acknowledgement of a world with a whole number of powerful ones. But Yahweh is saying, don't work for them, work for me. That's the Ten Commandments. Go forward a generation, the leader who comes after Moses is Joshua, and he puts out that call to his people. He says, cut off the powerful ones who your ancestors served in Mesopotamia. Cut off the powerful ones that we served in Egypt. Cut off the powerful ones who the Amorites served, the people in the lands that we're going into, and work only for Yahweh. Again, an acknowledgement of other powerful ones, but you're going to serve this one. So this forgetting, this moving away is being commanded. When we get to the 6th century BCE, there's a very broad scholarly agreement that all the books that make up the Hebrew canon, what we call the Old Testament, were reworked into a single piece by an editor or a redactor. And what they wanted to do was turn it all into a seamless story of God. And so these ancient texts, where there appear to be too many gods, or these ancient texts where there are other powerful beings calling the shots, or where it's clear that Yahweh is one of a number, those have to be massaged around and whitewashed over to make it look like a seamless story of God. And that's what they've done. So Elohim gets translated as God, not the powerful ones. But it really is not difficult to see beneath that layer of whitewash, because the shape of the stories tells you there's this plurality. The shape of the stories tells you there are these conflicts. And you only have to read a section like Genesis 6 to realize there are ET beings washing around in the text. And that's why I found it so interesting that about 10 years ago, the Vatican, Pope Benedict XVI, most conservative pope in my lifetime, sent his top spokespeople out to brief the public on the question of the theological implications of contact with other civilizations. And part of what they said was, if you go back to the Bible and read it again, you'll realize there are ETs in it from start to finish. And in the Scars of Eden, I shine a light on that and unpack what that really means.
You really hit on an important point too in the book regarding Plato. And I mean, Plato was such a revered figure in history. We talk about suppression and skeptics, but Plato talked about alien interventions. So why wasn't he ridiculed, and why wasn't he suppressed?
Timing is everything. And I think Plato came on the scene 2,500 years ago. And Dean, you're absolutely right. He laid all this on the table. When I was researching with the Scars of Eden, I was blown away by the insights that Plato had and made known to the world. And you're absolutely right. He believed that in our development as a species, we have been visited by non-human entities from somewhere other than planet Earth who have genetically modified us and adapted us for greater intelligence and greater consciousness. And that because of those interventions, we've become the technological species that we are. He also believed, he had a God concept. He believed in God as the primordial source of all things. He believed that before the material universe came consciousness. And as I read him on that topic, I thought, hold on, this sounds like what quantum research is demonstrating now, that consciousness is the prime organizing principle. Plato was there 2,500 years ago, and that was his God concept, the unified field of consciousness and order that then fractalized into the material universe. He believed that the material universe is just an emanation of that consciousness, that it exists so the consciousness can experience itself. And our story as conscious beings has its roots in that big story. Now that might sound, oh, that's interesting. People believed that 2,500 years ago. But what is more significant is that's what many of the church fathers believed at the beginning of Christianity. They absolutely believed what Plato had reported. We have more reasons than they did to take Plato seriously, because I think it was 1968, was it? 1966, that Apollo 8 took the first photograph that we ever saw of planet Earth floating in space. It wasn't a full picture of the globe, it was partly in the shadow of the moon. But when we saw that picture in the 1960s, it totally changed how we pictured the planet. If you look at the early seasons of Star Trek from the 1960s, for instance, the way they depicted the planet was a globe of blue seas and then sort of golden land masses. And it just looks like a map that's been wrapped around a globe. Right. And that's what we thought our planet looked like. Then when Apollo 8 took those pictures, we realized, no, it's actually this swirly kind of pattern. There's a lot of white from all the cloud. There's white, there's blue, there's green, there's gold. That's exactly how Plato described planet Earth as viewed from a distance 2,500 years ago. So really, in the 60s, everyone should have gone racing back to Plato to ask, how did he know that? And if he got that right, what else did he get right? And certainly his stories of human origins absolutely line up with what I'm talking about in Escaping from Eden and the Scars of Eden, a worldview that has space for a God concept, but also has space for what I am saying is embedded in the Bible
Yeah.
and in mythologies all around the world. This history of other species intervening in our development and shaping human history.
Australian Aboriginals talk about the Pleiadians being our ancestors. So I always thought that if Australia was never colonised by the English or colonised by any other country, and Australia belonged wholly and solely to the Aboriginals who, you know, it was their country, could you imagine that that culture would be leading the world in talking about humanity's real origins?
Yes, the picture that emerges in the Scars of Eden is that there is knowledge all around the world of our ET origins and our ET neighbors, but somehow that knowledge never makes its way into the textbooks and into the official narrative. And it's really all to do with whose empire are you living in? Because yes, the knowledge was here among original Australians of interventions from extraterrestrials, and the Pleiades, as you say, plays a big role in those stories. They would credit Pleiadian peoples with nurturing their culture, with teaching them how to farm and live sustainably and live in balance on the earth. Native American peoples tell the same stories about Pleiadians, and they will give some other details to those processes. But of course, both Australia and America got colonized by Europeans who brought a different story of origins. And if you take the example of what happened in South and Central America, there you've got Catholic forces going in the mainly through the 1500s and Catholicizing Central and South America, which is a very polite way of saying executing the local priesthoods.
Right.
And suppressing all the local knowledge of our ancient past, and then planting churches and schools across that continent to teach the real story of where we all came from and our place in the universe. And so the process of educating went hand in glove with the process of suppressing. I mean, they literally executed the priesthoods, burned the books that shared these other stories. But what I find interesting and encouraging, and I talk about this in the Scars of Eden, is those old stories never went away. Some choice copies got sent to the King of Spain, the King of Portugal, into the Vatican Library for the Pope. So they had the knowledge of what these ancient cultures talked about. But 200 years later, a new generation of priests and monks is in the country, and credit to them because it was a Dominican friar, Francisco Jimenez, who was entrusted with the Mayan story. The survivors of that priesthood, the priesthood of the feathered serpent, came to him, a Dominican friar, and they said, we would like to share with you this book that tells our story of who we are and where we came from. And he read it, he translated it. It became the Popol Vuh, the people's book, and it tells the Mayan story of beginnings, which is very open about the ET aspect of our origins.
Yep. I love the way you described the Westall Primary School mass sighting in Australia back in 1966 in the book. That was a classic case of suppression.
Incredible. Absolutely incredible, because it was a mass sighting. The media were there. The media were there within minutes. The military were there, government officials were there, the police were there, and you actually had two adjacent schools that were buzzed by flying saucers. And yes, I enjoy that bit in the Scars of Eden as well. I love telling that story because it's such a vivid experience that was reported. These children went out, these craft came very close to their school. One landed in a paddock right adjacent to the school. One of the children actually ran and touched the craft and had to be hospitalized as a result. By the afternoon, the media have gone, the military have gone, all the kids and staff have been herded into the school hall. The chemistry teacher who'd taken photographs of everything, she's been wrestled with by some official and her camera taken away from her. Officials in blue suits have shut down the kids who were talking to the press. Now they're all locked in the assembly hall And the principal is telling them, nothing happened this morning. A weather balloon is what you saw. And if you say anything else, you will be expelled.
Wow.
And this was a message to these kids who knew what they'd seen. And it's, at one level, it's a horrible story, because what are you doing to those children? What exercise of power is this, that it's purely your power over these children that's going to shape what happened? You're going to isolate them psychologically in that way. There are other schools that have had this experience. I think of
Zimbabwe?
Zimbabwe, the school at Rua. And in other places, I'm pleased to say, and Papua New Guinea is another. And I remember seeing the principal of the school in Papua New Guinea who apologized a generation later for doing exactly what the principal at Westall did. But it's curious that 50 years later, those children who were silenced are now allowed to go on TV and talk about what happened. Not all of them want to. I mean, some of them never want to remember what happened and won't talk about it and just won't go there. But there are a significant number who now as adults will say, this is what happened, this is what we experienced. And researchers have found that when they've tried to drill down into the original story, officially nothing happened. Despite the fact there were government officials and the military present, there was no official acknowledgement that anything ever happened, and there still isn't to this day. If you go to Channel 9, I think it was, who had filmed there and interviewed the children, you go through all the spools of film from the news from that period, get to April the 6th, 1966, that spool has been taken and we can't watch it. We're not even allowed to watch the interview footage.
Wow.
And so you have to ask, more than 50 years later, what is so shocking about what happened at Westall in 1966 that the government can't even acknowledge now that something happened? Could they not just say something happened, we don't know what it is? Well, apparently not.
No.
And that ought to get our attention.
I mean, you wonder where the suppression is actually being initiated from. Is it human initiation, or is it coming from the powerful ones? You know, is it coming from a place higher than humanity?
Yes, I think that's very likely. When people ask authorities, why can you not declassify everything? Well, I think there may be answers to that. I mean, if, as I believe to be the case, we have been in contact for 70 years at a covert government level, so that's a degree beyond what the official disclosures are saying. The official disclosures are saying we've been engaging with UFOs and we've had units investigating those encounters and investigating physical materials from crash retrievals. That's now what the official story is, just in case anyone missed that.
Yep.
So I would go the next step and say that actually we've been in contact at a covert government level for 70 years. What happens then if the big story is broken and that's admitted, and actually we've been suppressing this, we've been lying to you for 70 years? The political fallout out of that could be really messy. How would we feel about our place in our own countries if such important information can be kept from us? But you can see that if you are wanting to run an empire, I mean, let's put it into the past because it's easier to talk about it that way. It was very convenient to have a universe where you've got God at the top, the emperor under him, and then the bishops and governors under them and the people at the bottom. That's a very governable structure you've got there. Or God at the top, then the president, then government, then the people. That whole nice, orderly, we know what's going on, we tell you the news, we're in charge, that whole picture sort of breaks up the moment you say, actually, God's not at the top of that picture. Actually, there are other powerful entities who are really calling the shots. We're not quite sure who's in charge. Who's going to want to break that story? No governments want to come forward with a statement like that. So there are certainly human reasons for classification and suppression. But Dean, I agree with you. I think that the policy of non-disclosure may well originate with our visitors, with our ancient colonizers. I think there is a policy of non-disclosure that does govern our neighbors' interactions with planet Earth. And it may be from that ET policy that our political policies come of not disclosing, not declassifying everything. And that's what Haim Eshed has said. He was the head of space security for Israel for 27 years, a very credible, authoritative figure. And at the end of last year, he came forward and said, on the basis of his experience in that position, he would say there is an intergalactic federation that has a stakeholding in Project Earth, but they've chosen not to self-disclose because we're not ready, because we don't understand space and the universe we're in and our place within it. And they're waiting for a time to disclose.
Mm-hmm.
And I think K.M. Eshed is telling the truth. What he's saying is absolutely confirmed by what our ancestors have been saying for thousands of years.
Yep, I've had the Intergalactic Federation given to me on several occasions through people I've interviewed, and experiences slightly different, but all with the same theme. So there's, you just can't ignore it when it keeps coming up. You mentioned that you, after escaping from Eden, you were contacted by so many experiences who wanted to tell their own story, but didn't really want, any fanfare about it. It reminded me of Terry Lovelace, who wrote the Incident at Devil's Den, and then he's just followed up with a new book, The Reckoning. And one of the things I love about Terry's follow-up is the fact that he also has been contacted by so many experiences with stories, but with nothing to gain. And he's included about 30 of those in his new book. Is that what you're doing with the Scars of Eden?
Well, the people who've contacted me with their stories have certainly motivated me to continue in this field and to publish the Scars of Eden. But the Scars of Eden isn't a collection of other people's stories. I'm still very much rooted in the planet's stories. Mm-hmm. And the stories our ancestors have carried. But I do share some of those stories because I hope it will spark other people to acknowledge their own experiences, to recognize them, and then to share them. Because that's partly my own story. When people started contacting me with their own experiences, they would often ask, and it was part of their sounding me out, they would say, have you had a close encounter? Have you had an experience like this?
Yeah.
And at the beginning, I'd say, no, I haven't actually, but I know many people who have. But the more stories I heard, the more I thought, wait a minute, I did have that experience. I have experienced lost time. Wait a minute, I have seen entities that I didn't know what they were, and they were that sort of shape and size. And so it sparked my memories. And so I share enough in the Scars of Eden that I hope it will spark the memories of others as well.
Sorry to interrupt. One of those stories I found fascinating was Juan Perez.
Oh, yes.
Yep.
In Argentina.
Grab the book and, you can go straight to Juan's story, but I did find that very interesting indeed.
Well, I share Juan Perez's story because, particularly in my generation, I'm so familiar with people responding to someone with a close encounter story by saying, oh, they just want their 15 minutes of fame. They just want the limelight. They've got a story that they're touring with, doing talk shows with or whatever. And the illogic of that really has to be exposed. And Juan Perez's story I share for that reason, because he had a close encounter when he was 12 years old in Acevedo in Argentina. He had an encounter on his grandfather's farm. And it wasn't a particularly frightening close encounter, other than the fact he didn't know what was going on and his horse died as a result of the contact experience. What did traumatize him was how people responded to him after he came back and said, something happened to me in the fields this morning, because he was pilloried, he was laughed at, he was treated with scorn and contempt. And another layer of his experience, and I hear this so many times, is that after the encounter, he began to have experience of precognition in dreams. He would dream that something was going to happen, and then a few days later it would happen. And often it would be unpleasant things that would happen. As a 12-year-old, he didn't know how to interpret this. He was disturbed by it. He thought, are my dreams causing things to happen? Or how could I know things in advance? And when he very tentatively shared that experience, that's when things became really unpleasant for him. And people didn't want to talk to him. They'd cross the road to avoid him. They wouldn't do business with him. And that continued into adulthood. And it was so unpleasant and difficult for him that he just moved into the interior even further onto a big farming property so that he could just be on his own, away from people, without having to deal with this horrible response from them. And it was only when the Argentinian filmmaker Alan Stevelman contacted him, and he'd seen footage of him when he was, I think, 14 years old, and thought, I've got to meet that person because I can see he's had an authentic experience. And he probed a bit and he discovered, oh, he's living on his own out in the country because he's still so traumatized by what happened 40 years ago. Alan thought, I have to meet him. I have to talk to him. And so they met. And Alan began a journey with Juan Perez that was an incredible journey of healing, simply through listening to him in the first instance, listening to him with respect. And that journey of healing became a film, Witness of Another World. And I would recommend that movie to absolutely anybody. If you've got zero interest in the topic, you will still be absorbed by that movie. If you give it zero credibility, watch that movie, and at least you will understand that these experiences are not about self-promotion, absolutely the opposite, and begin to understand the psychological impact of what some of these contact experiences is.
In your research, I mean, there are so many different reports of types of ETs that people encounter, but has your research been able to identify a particular race that seems relevant to our history?
Well, you mentioned the Pleiades and people from the Pleiades, and they would be people who crop up. It's very interesting that they are almost always mentioned in a positive light. So Native American peoples, Aboriginal Australian peoples talk about the Pleiadians as their helpers, the people who came in the distant past, helped them to survive a time of famine, or taught them how to farm, or taught them the rudiments of civilization. They're mentioned in a positive light. And the ancient texts talk about 3 regions of space that our visitors have come from. Pleiades is one, Orion is another, and I always blank on this third name, the Sirius star system. And so the Dogon people, for instance, of Mali, West Africa, they talk about a planet orbiting Sirius C as being the source of their civilization, and their knowledge relates to ancient Egyptian knowledge as well. So there are some hints as to where some of our visitors may be coming from. I am really intrigued by the Pleiadian stories, and I find a lot of reassurance in them because it suggests that on this intergalactic council, we do have some friends, and that when we talk about ETs, it's not all invasion of the body snatchers, Mars attacks, Independence Day kind of entities we're talking about. We've got some who are here because they like us, they care very deeply about us and our planet and have a nurturing relationship towards us. And on the days when I'm most despairing about our political leaders, I take some reassurance that there is some other authority in the picture beyond the human as well. And I do think the Pleiadians, or among the Pleiadians, are people who are very much on our side.
What's the one thing you want people to take away from the Scars of Eden?
I think I want people to understand that conversation about ET contact is a far more grounded and rooted subject than they may have thought. If all they've ever been aware of is people coming on the TV saying, I had this bizarre experience, I want them to know actually our ancestors have talked about this seriously for thousands of years. And just because you didn't get taught it at school doesn't mean there isn't a very credible, respectable heritage of teaching and literature on this subject. I'd encourage people to look into it. But more than anything, I want the Scars of Eden to give people the courage and the permission to share their own stories. if in our families and friendship circles, we can listen with respect to each other's anomalous experiences, there's a heap of stuff that we can learn from one another. And that's the kind of disclosure that I would like to see, not one that comes from on high with government announcements, but as we listen to one another and learn from each other. And the Scars of Eden is really a call upon people to do that.
Is there a third book on the table?
There is a third book on the table, absolutely, because I found that Escaping from Eden is a gateway book. Many people have read that. It's taken them into this topic. The Scars of Eden is a gateway book as well. You can give it to absolutely anybody with zero interest in the topic, that it'll take them on a journey. And there are many red pills you can take that get you into this world, but it's a whole rabbit warren of interconnecting subjects. And as I've researched the Scars of Eden, I've realized that other information, along with the ET narrative, got suppressed at the same time. So those books that were buried in the Nag Hammadi desert that became the Gnostic Gospels, those books that got archived that became the Popol Vuh, they talked about our ET origins, but they also talked about other things as well, to do with who we are and what is possible for us. And those are some of the secrets that I'm going to be probing in the sequel to The Scars of Eden.
Fantastic. Paul, thanks again for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dean. Can I just give a shout out to my website and my channel?
Yes.
If you want to follow what I'm doing, you can go to paulanthonywallis.com. That's Anthony with an H, Wallis, W-A-L-L-I-S, paulanthonywallis.com. Or you can go to the Fifth Kind TV, fifthkind.tv, and you can find us on YouTube as well. And you can find me on the Paul Wallis channel on YouTube. And all the things we've talked about today, I probe in those places.
And of course, we'll have that information attached to either the article or the information attached with this video. Paul, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Paul Anthony Wallis joining us.